police crime museums all over Europe, there are items of evidence that have brought some of the world's worst criminals to justice. Behind every object in these black museums is a fascinating and sometimes macabre story.
Document analysis is one of the oldest of the forensic sciences. Even in Roman courts it was considered admissible evidence. The expert analyst will be looking for various kinds of information in handwriting, typewriting or printing, as well as less obvious clues that might be evidence of forgery or fraud. In our first case, known as the telegram murder, it was something as simple as spelling that betrayed the mark of the murderer's pen.
Irene Wilkins was a 31-year-old school cook who lived with a widowed mother in Streatham, South London. Just before Christmas in 1921, she was looking for a new job, and with this in mind, she placed an advert in the Morning Post. The ad appeared early on the 20th of December, and miraculously, that very day, she received a reply. The telegram read, "Morning Post, come immediately. 4:30 train, Waterloo, Bournemouth Central. Car will meet train. Expense, no object. Urgent." It was signed Wood, Beach House. Irene quickly sent a confirmation telegram before setting off to catch the 4:30 to Bournemouth.
Not long after she'd left home, this telegram was returned by the post office, address unknown. At first, Irene's mother thought it was just a mistake with the address, as there had been some spelling errors in the original Beach House telegram. But by late evening, when there was no word of her daughter, Mrs. Wilkins reported her missing. Next morning, Bournemouth police received some disturbing news.
When a 70-year-old farm labourer was walking across the meadows, he noticed two cows sniffing at something laid out on the ground under a bush. On closer inspection, he found it was the body of a young woman and subsequently reported it, and the police arrived.
The watch that Irene had been wearing was engraved with her initials, and it wasn't long before she was positively identified.
Post-mortem showed that Irene Wilkins had been struck 3 severe blows on the head with a blunt object. It was a violent attack, and any one of those blows could have caused her death.
Although it was Christmas time, the local police cancelled their leave and worked through the holiday. A close examination of the scene revealed a set of tyre marks close to where the body had been found. The tracks had a distinctive and deep tread and were identified as coming from Dunlop Magnum tyres. The police publicised the fact that they were looking for a vehicle with this make of tyre.
On New Year's Day, they found Irene's case amongst some bushes in Branksome Woods outside Bournemouth. It was mildewed, suggesting it had been there since the murder, and the contents were untouched.
A local man who was walking his goats at about the time of the murder remembers seeing a car with dipped headlights, which must have been a quite unusual sight in that area at that time of night.
If this was the murderer's car, then it would mean that this man had probably disturbed the killer.
The police knew that the car was hugely significant. The telegram to Irene Wilkins had said that she would be picked up at the station by a car. They needed to find someone who had seen her being picked up, and they needed somebody who could identify the make of the vehicle.
As a result of the publicity in local papers, a gentleman did report that he had seen a grey chauffeur-driven car meeting a girl rather like the picture in the papers of Irene at the station.
The police discovered that 2 other women who had also placed ads had received very similar telegrams, and that they too had been sent from the Bournemouth area.
Now, back in those days, in the 1920s, and as far as I know, in the 30s as well, if you went to send a telegram at the post office, you wrote it out by hand.
The handwritten telegram to Irene had contained several spelling mistakes. Bournemouth was written without the E, expense was spelled with a C and not an S, and the word immediately was also misspelled. These mistakes were also apparent on the telegrams that had been sent to the 2 other women, who luckily had decided not to keep their rendezvous.
Nowadays we wouldn't take a great deal of notice of misspellings. I mean, Bournemouth without an E in the middle, I can't think that misspelling is unique to that person. It's the letter designs and all the general writing features that is unique to them.
The handwriting of all the car owners in the area using Dunlop Magnum tyres was checked against the 3 decoy telegrams, but after 4 months, the police were no nearer to catching the killer. It was decided to review all the information they had acquired so far. This meant looking through some 22,000 documents. Eventually, the detective struck gold. During an interview, a witness at Bournemouth had spoken of seeing a car he thought was an older style Mercedes. Then, as a note, he reported seeing it again. and had taken down its registration, LK7405. Police soon tracked it down. The Mercedes belonged to a Mr. and Mrs. Sutton who lived in Bournemouth. It was their chauffeur, however, who actually drove the car. His name was Thomas Henry Alloway.
But when the police called to question Alloway, he'd vanished, along with Mr. Sutton's chequebook. He'd also sent his wife and child away to family in Reading. At last, the police felt they had a serious suspect. They believed that he'd headed to London. But several days went by, and there was still no sign of him. A watch was put on the house in Reading.
Allaway goes to Reading because his wife is staying in Reading, and a policeman recognises Allaway and gives chase to him.
Alloway, stop!
Unfortunately, the policeman can't keep up with Allaway, and a member of the public pushes out his foot, and Allaway falls over flat on his face. The policeman turns up and sits on Allaway until further help arrives.
Thomas Alloway had been a chauffeur since the First World War ended in 1918. His war career was chequered as he had deserted while serving as a driver in the Royal Army Service Corps.
Initially, Alloway was charged with forging his employer's cheques, but while he was in custody, the police set about gathering evidence of his connection with Irene Wilkins' murder. Betting slips which had been found in his possession at the time of his arrest were compared with the handwriting on the 3 telegrams. There were striking similarities. Then, when asked to write out the contents of the telegram, Alloway reproduced all the original spelling mistakes. He was charged with the murder of Irene Wilkins and said, in response to the charge, "I don't know anything about it."
Alloway's arrest caused a stir and was not without controversy.
He was picked out in an identification parade, purporting to have seen him 18 weeks earlier, and yet his photograph had been published in the Sunday Pictorial the previous Sunday. Everybody would have read that newspaper because it was a local murderer.
At his trial at Winchester in July 1922, an acquaintance testified that he'd seen Alloway changing the tyres on the Mercedes from Dunlop Magnum to Michelin.
The defence tried to discredit the reliability of handwriting analysis, citing earlier criminal cases where it had been found fallible, but the expert stood firm. He'd made a close study of Alloway's handwriting and brought specimens to court. Alloway's admitted writing and disputed writing were arranged side by side for comparison. A whole document, as well as single words and letters, were displayed.
Just to start off really with the general writing habits, it's obvious from the telegrams that the writing slopes forward. The positioning of the words on the document is also quite important, and you can see where you have lines on the body of the telegram, the writing just sits quite neatly on the line. It isn't cutting through it, it isn't sitting above it. One quite good feature about them is that you have the indentation of the wording on the body of the telegram isn't right at the left-hand edge of the lines. There is a small gap between that left-hand edge and where the actual text of the telegram begins to be written. There are several similarities in letter design. There is a G in the word urgent which appears on 2 of the telegrams, which really looks like a figure 8 or a letter S if you like. That is quite a nice feature. So a number of similarities are found in the layout of the documents and also the letter designs.
It also appeared that Alloway had attempted to disguise his handwriting when asked to supply specimens.
If you look specifically at certain letter designs on the comparison chart, you can see the matches between the questioned handwritings on the telegrams and the specimens. One example, the letter M, which has that very wide and closed introductory loop to it. Now, curiously, that loop is missing on the known handwriting 1922, presumably the documents that were written by this gentleman at the specific request of the police. So it's a very difficult thing to do, to disguise your writing consistently, particularly to make the writing look readable and natural.
The expert declared that such a series of similarities couldn't exist in the handwriting of 2 different people.
Alloway's trial was short. His alibi, that he had walked with his wife to the cinema, then spent the evening in the Conservative Club and a local hotel, was unconvincing. He was found guilty and sentenced to death.
It's presumed from the court of law that the motive was that he wanted sex, though it was all circumstantial evidence. I'm not so sure that this was so, because why didn't he go to a prostitute in Bournemouth? Then there was a Mr. Humphreys giving evidence in the court of law. The exact description of the clothes Allaway is wearing after having seen him for only 4.5 seconds in the lighting of the street lamps of the 1920s. Dim gas.
On the eve of his execution, Allaway is believed to have confessed his guilt to the prison governor, but he gave no reason for his crime. On the 22nd of August 1922, he was hanged.
Allaway's motive remains a mystery. The telegram murder was a senseless crime, where the written word ensnared the victim, but also proved crucial. in the capture of the killer. The next case from the Crime Museum also comes from the 1920s. Pieces of paper, one by one, led the police to a murderer, and writing, almost invisible to the naked eye, proved central in solving what appeared to be a baffling case.
Vivian Messiter had moved to Southampton in the middle of September 1928. He had taken a job as a sales agent for the Wolf's Head Oil Company, using a dockside garage as his workplace. Messiter rented a room nearby, but just over a month after his arrival, he vanished.
Messiter was last seen on the 30th of October 1928, which was a Tuesday, and he'd been in Southampton only a month. When he vanished from his lodgings, it concerned obviously his landlady, and she mentioned it to her husband, the exotically named Alba Parrott, who happened to be a retired police officer.
When Mr. Parrott checked his lodger's room, he found that Messiter had taken none of his clothes or belongings with him. When Messiter failed to contact them, the Wolf's Head Oil Company sent him several letters, but he never replied.
So a police officer was dispatched round to the garage where Messiter worked to see if he could find out what had happened to him. And he found the place bolted and barred. It seemed that Messiter had fled Southampton as quickly as he'd arrived. So by January 1929, the Wolf's Head Oil Company, assuming Messiter to have walked off the job, appointed a replacement, a man called Henry Passmore. It was Passmore who forced the padlock on the door and got inside the depot. There he found Messiter's Morris car loaded with cans of oil and countless more cans of oil packed into crates which were stacked from floor to ceiling. Behind one of these rows of stacked crates, he found a body.
When police arrived at the scene, they found a body that had been lying there for some 10 weeks. There was blood everywhere. Southampton police don't seem to have been the brightest police source available at that time, and the initial diagnosis was a brain hemorrhage. This unlikely finding was relatively quickly contradicted by the discovery of a gaping hole above Vivian Messiter's left eyebrow. This led to a further conclusion, that of a shooting. Eventually, Sir Bernard Spilsbury arrived at the scene. By this time, the truth had emerged. Messiter had been brutally battered to death with a hammer.
The body had lain where it had fallen, in a pool of blood, and blood was also splattered halfway up the whitewashed walls. A further search of the premises eventually revealed a bloody hammer, and stuck to it was some hair from an eyebrow.
Very little was known about Messiter's life and habits. By profession, he was a mechanical engineer who had lived most of his life in America. He lived alone, and though he had relatives in England, he'd received no visitors at his lodgings during his time in Southampton.
Detective Chief Inspector Prothero from Scotland Yard was called in to handle the case. One of the first things of interest that Prothero found at the dockside garage was Messiter's order book. A number of the front pages had been torn out, but the carbon transfer sheets revealed customers' names and addresses around Southampton. When checked, these all proved to be false. He also found a receipt book, again with its front pages torn out.
Then during a search of Messiter's lodgings, police discovered a letter. It was from a W.F. Thomas, replying to an advert for a sales rep placed in the Southern Daily Echo just 1 week before Messiter went missing.
I was a junior advertisement clerk in the office of the Evening Echo at Southampton. And I recall a man coming in. His name was Vivian Messiter, and he wanted a man to assist him in the garage. So an advertisement was readily compiled, and a receipt was issued. But about 3 months afterwards, the police came into the office and showed the receipt that I'd issued and asked me to confirm the date on the receipt. I was able to do that, which made it clear that Messiter was at least alive in October.
It transpired that a man called William F. Thomas had indeed been taken on as a sales rep just 2 days before Messiter disappeared. And when police called at the address on the letter, they were told that this Thomas had left his lodgings on the 3rd of November, just a few days after starting his new job.
5 days after Messiter's body was found at Southampton, Thomas's description was circulated to the police and the press, and the police at Stoke-on-Trent recognised it as the description of a man called William Henry Podmore, known to them as an incorrigible villain. Well, Podmore was very quickly traced to a hotel in London and arrested. Podmore tried to tough it out. He was a mechanic by trade, but he was a rogue by inclination, and he was wanted for assorted scams by various police forces. Now, by the time the police caught up with him, he'd had, 10 full weeks to concoct a story, but having concocted it, he pretty much stuck by it. And it was this, that he had indeed taken a job with Messiter under the assumed name of Thomas. He'd only actually, he said, met Messiter twice. On both occasions, Messiter was with a man called either Maxton or Baxton. Well, Podmore said he'd seen Messiter on the morning of the 30th of October, but finding Messiter and Maxton or Baxton having a furious row, he said he'd left them to it. Of course, no one called Maxton or Baxton ever surfaced.
Podmore denied any involvement with Messiter's death, but eventually admitted stealing wage packets in Wiltshire and also fraud in Manchester. He was given 6 months imprisonment for each of these crimes. Prothero, however, was still convinced that Podmore was a murderer, and with his suspects safely in prison, the inspector looked at the evidence again. He turned his attention to Messiter's receipt book.
The first receipt, after the torn-out pages, had already been checked and found to be genuine, but now, under the oblique light of his desk lamp, Prothero thought he could see the faint marks of other writing. They had been made by a pencil on the previous page, which had since been torn out. Prothero had the receipt photographed under steeply angled lighting, and the indented impression suddenly became readable.
It read, "Received from Wolf's Head Oil Company, commission on Cromer and Bartlett, 5 gallons at 6pence, WFT." But there was no such company, and there had been no such sale. The police now had evidence that Podmore, under the name W.F. Thomas, had been swindling Messiter out of commission on imaginary business.
Prothero believed that Messiter had spotted the scam and threatened Podmore with the law, and that Podmore, in a fit of temper, picked up a hammer that was lying there and attacked him. He then ripped out the receipts bearing his initials. He couldn't have known that the indentations of his writing would prove the case against him.
When you write on a pad of paper with a writing instrument such as, say, a fountain pen or a ballpoint pen, if you put reasonably heavy pressure actually onto the paper with the pen, you will disturb the paper fibres on the page below and form what we call an indented impression of handwriting. Nowadays, for indented impressions that are faint, which are not readable, you can detect those using a piece of equipment called the ESDA. It's an electrostatic process, and basically what we do is to put the document in question on the machine itself, charge the surface of that document up electrostatically, and you find that there's a higher charge that sticks to the area where you have indented impressions of handwriting on the document. The next part of the technique is to pour photocopy toner over the surface of that document, and that sticks far more to the area of heavy charge than the area of light charge, so that the indented impressions of handwriting are then visualised on the surface of the plastic.
Chief Inspector Prothero now believed he had a case against Podmore. In addition, 2 of his fellow prisoners testified that, while inside, Podmore had revealed that he was Messiter's murderer.
In March 1930, over a year after the crime, Podmore finally stood trial for the murder of Vivian Messiter. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. An appeal against the conviction was dismissed, and William Podmore was hanged at Winchester Prison on April 22nd, 1930.
The stories of William Podmore and Thomas Alloway show how something as simple as handwriting can identify a killer. The Crime Museum is full of cases where criminals believe they've covered their tracks, leaving no evidence that links them to their victims. But the way we write defies attempts to disguise it, and the impression left by a murderer's pen can, in expert hands, resurface to name the guilty.